Hi, I'm Emma, and when my stepmom Victoria told me I was nothing but a burden on my father's happiness, I simply smiled and said, "Thanks for the lesson." What I didn't expect was for her husband, my own father, to serve her divorce papers the next morning. But what if I told you that those 4 words weren't the end of her manipulation? What if the real shock wasn't Victoria's cruelty, but discovering the 18-month campaign she'd been running to isolate my father from everyone who truly loved him, including me? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Why would a woman destroy her own marriage just to hurt a stepchild? And how did one moment of calm response unravel a web of lies so intricate that even I didn't realize I'd been living inside it? The morning mist was still clinging to the Oregon pines when I pulled into the driveway of the house that used to feel like home. Riverside had always been one of those towns where everyone knew everyone, where your reputation followed you through generations like a family heirloom. The Thompson name meant something here. My grandfather had built half the downtown buildings, my father kept the books for most of the local businesses, and my mother had taught 3rd grade for 15 years before cancer took her voice, then her breath, then finally her smile. That was 3 years ago. The house on Maple Street had felt hollow ever since, like a music box with a broken spring. Dad tried to fill the silence with longer hours at his accounting firm. I tried to fill it with weekend visits from my downtown loft, but we both knew something essential had gone missing when Mom died. Something that neither spreadsheets nor Sunday dinners could replace. Then Victoria arrived, all honey-colored hair and real estate confidence, with a laugh that seemed to echo in all the right places. She was new to Riverside, which should have been our first warning sign. People didn't just move to Riverside unless they were running from something or chasing something specific. But Dad was so grateful to hear laughter in the house again that he never asked which category Victoria belonged to. Their courtship was swift, efficient, like a business transaction dressed up in flowers and candlelight dinners. Victoria moved in 6 months after Mom's 3rd death anniversary, married Dad exactly 12 months later, and immediately began what she called refreshing the family dynamic. The wedding photos still sat on the mantel, but somehow Mom's pictures had gradually migrated to smaller frames in less prominent locations. I told myself it was natural. Victoria wasn't trying to replace Mom, she was just making space for herself. When she suggested I call her Victoria instead of any maternal title, I thought it showed respect for my mother's memory. When she reorganized the kitchen and donated Mom's favorite coffee mugs to charity, I assumed she was trying to help Dad heal. When she scheduled family dinners that coincidentally conflicted with my work deadlines or social plans, I figured she was still learning my routine. The changes were subtle, incremental, like watching your hair grow or your face age. You don't notice it day by day, but one morning you look in the mirror and wonder when you became a stranger to yourself. That's how it felt watching Dad transform under Victoria's influence. The man who used to call me every Tuesday just to hear about my week suddenly seemed too busy with Victoria's renovation projects and social obligations. The father who never missed a birthday dinner, or graduation or promotion celebration, started double booking himself with Victoria's real estate events and charity functions. But I told myself this was healthy. Dad deserved happiness after 3 years of grief. If Victoria could bring back his smile, if she could make him laugh over morning coffee and look forward to coming home each evening, then maybe the distance between us was just the natural evolution of a father learning to live again. The morning of what I now think of as the lesson started like any other Saturday. I'd driven over to help Dad with his quarterly tax preparation, something we'd done together since I turned 16, and showed an aptitude for organization. It was our tradition, our excuse to spend 4 uninterrupted hours together talking about everything except the obvious sadness that still lived in the corners of the house. Victoria greeted me at the door with that practiced smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. She was dressed for what she called power brunch with her real estate colleagues, all sharp angles and coordinated accessories. Her perfume hung in the air like expensive fog, something floral and aggressive that made the house smell nothing like the vanilla and cinnamon it used to carry when Mom was alive. "Emma, darling," she said, and the word darling always sounded like it had quotation marks around it when she spoke to me. "Your father's in his office, buried in those dreadful numbers. I don't know how you two can stand looking at spreadsheets for hours on end." I smiled and headed toward Dad's home office, the converted bedroom where he kept his overflow work and all the client files too sensitive to leave at the firm. The door was closed, which was unusual. Dad always kept it open during our Saturday sessions, said the fresh air helped him think more clearly. I knocked softly. "Dad, ready to tackle the quarterly nightmare?" His voice came through the door, muffled and tired. "Emma, honey, I'm sorry. Victoria scheduled something this morning that I completely forgot about. Can we rain check until next weekend?" I stood there for a moment, my hand still raised to knock again. This was the third time in 2 months that our Saturday tradition had been cancelled for one of Victoria's events. Each time, Dad had sounded genuinely apologetic, genuinely surprised by the conflict, like he hadn't been the one to agree to whatever Victoria had planned. Victoria appeared beside me with a travel mug of coffee and that same distant smile. "I'm sure you understand, Emma. Michael's been working such long hours lately, and we barely get any couple time together. Sometimes marriage requires prioritizing your spouse over other relationships." The way she said other relationships made it sound like I was some distant acquaintance instead of his daughter, but I just nodded and said I understood, because what else do you say when someone explains why you're not the priority anymore? Besides, Victoria continued, following me toward the front door, "You're 24 now. Don't you think it's time you started building your own life instead of depending on your father for entertainment every weekend?" I paused with my hand on the doorknob. The morning light was streaming through the frosted glass panels, creating patterns on the hardwood floor that reminded me of the shadow puppets Mom used to make with her hands when I couldn't sleep as a child. For a moment, I could almost hear her voice saying, "Some people show you who they are through their actions, sweetheart. When they do, believe them." "You're absolutely right, Victoria," I said, turning to face her fully. "Thanks for the lesson." Her smile faltered slightly, like she'd expected argument, or tears, or some kind of dramatic reaction that would give her ammunition for later conversations with Dad. Instead, I pulled out my phone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And canceled the dinner reservation I'd made for Dad's birthday the following weekend. Then I deleted the reminder I'd set to call him on Tuesday. Then I removed the standing calendar invitation for our Saturday sessions. Victoria watched me with growing uncertainty. "What are you doing?" "Taking your advice," I said, slipping my phone back into my purse. "Building my own life, starting now." I drove away from Maple Street that morning with a strange sense of lightness, like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for 18 months. For the first time since Victoria had entered our lives, I felt like I could see the situation clearly. All those cancelled plans, all those scheduling conflicts, all those subtle suggestions that I was taking up too much of Dad's time, they weren't accidents or coincidences. They were strategy. But what Victoria didn't realize was that in trying to teach me my place, she'd accidentally taught me something much more valuable. She'd shown me exactly who she was and what she wanted, and more importantly, she'd given me permission to stop pretending otherwise. I spent that Saturday afternoon at Pine Grove Cemetery, sitting beside Mom's headstone with a thermos of the coffee she used to make on weekend mornings. The inscription read, "Lisa Thompson, beloved wife and mother," and underneath in smaller text, "She loved with her whole heart." Dad had chosen those words, back when his grief was still fresh and honest, before Victoria had arrived to help him process his feelings and move forward with his life. "I think I finally understand what you meant about people showing you who they are," I said to the polished granite. I just wasn't ready to see it before. The wind picked up, rustling the maple leaves overhead, and for a moment it sounded almost like Mom's laugh, not the bitter hollow sound that had filled the house in her final months, but the real laugh from before the illness, when she used to read my school essays aloud at dinner and declare them worthy of publication. That evening, I made dinner for myself in my downtown loft, something I rarely did anymore since Dad had started expecting me for Sunday meals at the house. I opened a bottle of wine, lit a candle, and ate slowly while watching the Riverside River flow past my windows. The water moved with purpose, carving its path through the landscape with patience and persistence, wearing away obstacles not through force, but through consistent, unwavering pressure. I understood something about rivers that night. They don't fight the rocks in their path, they simply flow around them until the rocks have no choice but to change shape. By Sunday morning, I had 17 missed calls from Dad and 12 text messages asking where I was, if I was okay, whether I was upset about something. Victoria had apparently told him that I'd seemed emotional and unstable during my visit, that I'd left abruptly after she'd tried to have a caring conversation about my dependence on family relationships. I texted back a single message: "I'm great, Dad. Thanks for the space to build my own life. Love you." Then I turned off my phone and spent the day hiking the trails around Mount Riverside, something I hadn't done since before Mom got sick. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke from distant chimneys. With each step up the mountain, I felt like I was walking away from something heavy and towards something I'd forgotten I missed. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, there were 6 more missed calls from Dad and a voicemail from Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor since I was in elementary school. "Emma, honey," her familiar voice crackled through the speaker, "I hope you don't mind me calling, but your father seems quite worried about you. He was over here this afternoon asking if I'd seen you, saying Victoria thought you might be having some kind of emotional crisis. I told him you seemed perfectly fine to me yesterday morning when I saw you leave, but he seemed convinced something was wrong. Anyway, call me if you need anything, dear. You know I loved your mother like a sister." I saved the voicemail but didn't call back immediately. Instead, I sat in my window seat and watched the lights come on across Riverside, each one representing a household with its own complicated dynamics and unspoken truths. In 18 months, Victoria had managed to convince Dad that my normal behavior was somehow concerning, that my independence was actually instability, that my attempts to maintain our relationship were actually unhealthy dependence. The manipulation was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria hadn't turned Dad against me directly, instead she'd changed his perception of me gradually, reframing my actions through a lens of concern and care that made her seem like the protective wife worried about her husband's troubled daughter. But manipulation, like any complex system, has vulnerabilities. And Victoria had just revealed hers. She needed Dad to believe that I was the problem in order to maintain her position as the solution, which meant that if I stopped being a problem, if I actually took her advice and built my own life, her narrative would start to crack. Without a dependent, emotional stepdaughter to worry about, what reason would Dad have to limit his other relationships? Without my instability to manage, what would Victoria's role become? I opened my laptop and began typing. Not an angry email or a defensive explanation, but a simple thank you note to Victoria, because she really had taught me something valuable, even if it wasn't the lesson she'd intended to give. The next morning would bring revelations neither Victoria nor I could have anticipated. But that night, sitting in my own space with my own thoughts for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Mom died: the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are, regardless of who others think you should be. Mom always said that truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. No matter how much you try to stir it in or mix it up, it eventually separates and rises to the top where everyone can see it clearly. I was about to learn just how right she was. Parts 2. 5. The unraveling begins. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that makes everything look sharper, more defined. I woke up in my loft feeling strangely rested, like I'd been holding tension in muscles I didn't know existed, and had finally let them relax. The river outside my window caught the early sunlight, sending dancing reflections across my ceiling that reminded me of the kaleidoscope Mom used to keep on her nightstand. I made coffee in the French press I'd bought myself for my birthday, something Dad had forgotten this year for the first time in my life. Victoria had organized a surprise weekend getaway for him instead, a romantic bed and breakfast in the wine country that happened to conflict with the dinner I'd planned. When I'd mentioned the overlap, she'd suggested we celebrate when they got back, but somehow that celebration never materialized. As I sipped my coffee and watched Riverside wake up below me, my phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Emma, I'm worried about you. Victoria said you seemed upset yesterday. Can we talk today?" I stared at the message for a long moment, noting how even his concern was filtered through Victoria's interpretation of events. 3 years ago, Dad would have called immediately if he thought something was wrong. He would have shown up at my door with takeout and stayed until we'd talked through whatever was bothering me. Now he was asking permission to worry, seeking confirmation from a woman who'd known me for 18 months about the emotional state of the daughter he'd raised for 24 years. I typed back, "I'm not upset at all, Dad. Actually feeling really good. Hope your morning is going well." Then I turned off my phone and headed to work. My graphic design studio occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse downtown, a space I'd chosen specifically because the large windows faced the mountains instead of Maple Street. I'd been freelancing since graduating college, building a client base that included several Portland businesses and a growing number of online companies that appreciated my clean minimalist aesthetic. Riley Martinez knocked on my studio door around 10, carrying 2 cups from Sunset Cafe, and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd clearly been elected to check on me. Riley had been my best friend since high school, one of those rare people who could read your mood from across a room and knew exactly when to offer advice, versus when to just listen. "Okay, spill," Riley said, settling into the vintage armchair I kept for client meetings. "Mrs. Patterson called my mom this morning asking if I'd heard from you. Apparently your dad was over there yesterday, practically pacing a hole in her lawn, convinced you'd had some kind of breakdown." I accepted the coffee gratefully, breathing in the familiar scent of Sunset Cafe's signature roast. The cafe had been Mom's favorite place for weekend coffee dates, back when she was still strong enough for outings. The owner, Miguel, still asked about her sometimes, not knowing she'd passed. Victoria told Dad I seemed emotional and unstable after our conversation Saturday morning, I said. "She's concerned about my dependence on family relationships and thinks I need to build my own life." Riley's eyebrows shot up. "And you're okay with this because she's absolutely right," I said, settling into my desk chair. "I have been too dependent on Dad. I've been trying so hard to maintain our relationship exactly as it was before Mom died, that I didn't notice it was already gone." Riley studied my face with the intensity of someone fluent in the language of friendship. "You're different today." "I'm clearer today," I corrected. "For 18 months, I've been operating under the assumption that Victoria was just adjusting to her new role, that she needed time to find her place in our family dynamic. I kept making excuses for canceled plans and forgotten traditions because I thought she was trying her best. And now I realize she wasn't trying to fit into our family. She was trying to reshape it entirely, with me on the outside." Riley was quiet for a moment, processing. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing," I said, and the word felt surprisingly liberating. "I'm going to do exactly what Victoria suggested, build my own life, stop depending on Dad for entertainment, give them the space they apparently need." "Emma," Riley said gently, "you know your dad loves you, right? This Victoria thing, it's not about you not being enough." I know Dad loves me, I said. But love and prioritizing aren't the same thing. Victoria has made it clear where I rank in his new life, and honestly, that's okay. I'm 24. I should be building my own traditions, my own support system. Riley looked skeptical. This feels like you're giving up. It's not giving up, I said. It's accepting reality and responding accordingly. We spent the rest of the morning working in comfortable silence, Riley editing photos for a wedding client, while I finalized a logo design for a Portland brewery. Around noon my studio phone rang, which was unusual since most clients contacted me through email or my cell. Emma Thompson Design, I answered. Emma, it's Miguel, from Sunset Cafe. I hope you don't mind me calling, but your father was here earlier asking if I'd seen you. He seemed quite worried, said you'd gone missing or something. I felt a flush of embarrassment. I'm not missing Miguel. I'm just giving him some space like he asked for. Well, he didn't seem to know he'd asked for space, Miguel said carefully. He was talking about calling the police. Actually, said his wife thought you might be having some kind of crisis. The embarrassment deepened into something darker. Victoria had apparently escalated her narrative from emotional and unstable to genuinely concerning, painting Dad's worry as evidence that I was truly in trouble rather than simply taking her advice. Could you do me a favor, Miguel? I asked. If he comes in again, could you tell him you spoke to me and that I'm perfectly fine? I'm just busy with work. Of course, honey. But Emma, maybe you should call him directly. He really did seem worried. After I hung up, Riley looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. This is getting weird, Em. It's getting revealing, I said. Victoria needed Dad to worry about me this weekend to justify her comments about my emotional state. When I didn't fall apart or create drama, she had to escalate the narrative to maintain credibility. That's pretty calculated. Everything Victoria does is calculated, I said, pulling up my email. Watch this. I composed a brief message to Dad. Hi Dad, heard you were looking for me around town today. I'm doing great, just focusing on work, and building my own life like Victoria suggested. Thanks for understanding. Love you. I copied Victoria on the email. Within 20 minutes, my phone was ringing. Dad's number flashed on the screen, and for the first time in 18 months, I let it go to voicemail. The message was revealing. Emma, honey, I got your email and I'm confused. Victoria didn't suggest you disappear or stop talking to your family. She's worried about you. We both are. You've been acting strange lately, canceling dinners, not returning calls. This isn't like you. Please call me back. I played the voicemail for Riley, who whistled low. He genuinely doesn't remember her saying those things. He remembers a version of events where Victoria was being caring and supportive, and I was being emotional and unreasonable. I said, she's rewritten the narrative so effectively that he can't see the manipulation. So what now? Now I document everything, I said, forwarding the voicemail to my personal email account. And I continue doing exactly what Victoria told me to do. The rest of Monday passed quietly. I worked on client projects, had lunch at my favorite Vietnamese place downtown, and spent the evening organizing my apartment. No family drama, no canceled plans, no emotional phone calls, just the peaceful routine of a woman building her own life. Tuesday brought another text from Dad. Emma, please call me. Victoria thinks you might need professional help. I screenshotted the message and replied, I'm perfectly fine, Dad. Just following Victoria's advice about building independence. How's your week going? He didn't respond. Wednesday, Mrs. Patterson called again. This time, her voice carried notes of irritation rather than concern. Emma, dear, I hate to bother you, but your father was over here again last night. He's convinced something terrible has happened to you, and frankly, it's starting to worry me too. Victoria was with him, going on about how you've never been independent before, how this sudden change in behavior is alarming. She suggested he call Dr. Thompson to discuss intervention options. Dr. Thompson had been our family physician since I was a child, a kind man who'd helped us navigate Mom's illness with grace and compassion. The idea of Victoria involving him in her narrative made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Patterson," I said carefully, "have I seemed unwell to you? When you've seen me around the neighborhood, have I appeared to be having a crisis? Honey, you seem exactly the same as you always have, maybe a little happier actually, more relaxed." "Then please trust your own observations," I said. "I'm taking some space to focus on my career and personal growth. That's healthy, not concerning. But your father seems so worried." "My father is getting information from someone who has her own motivations," I said gently. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something? In the 18 months since Dad remarried, how many times have you seen me at the house?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not as much as before, now that you mention it, but I assumed that was natural, with him having a new wife and all." "How many times have you seen Victoria invite me to family gatherings or holiday celebrations?" Another pause. "I can't think of any specific occasions. And when you have seen me leaving the house, have I ever seemed upset or emotional?" "No," she said slowly. "Usually you look disappointed, but not upset, more like resigned." "Thank you for being honest," I said. "That's all I needed to know." Thursday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my studio. Thompson climbed the stairs to my office with the careful pace of a man in his 70s, carrying his familiar black medical bag, and wearing an expression of gentle concern. "Emma," he said when I opened the door, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Your father asked me to check on you." I invited him in, offered coffee, and settled across from him in my client meeting area. Dr. Thompson had always been a thoughtful man, someone who listened more than he spoke, and never rushed to judgment.
Hey!
"Your father is worried about you," he said without preamble. "He says you've been exhibiting concerning behavior lately, becoming isolated and unresponsive." "What kind of concerning behavior?" I asked. "Not returning phone calls, canceling family obligations, sudden changes in routine." He paused. "Emma, are you experiencing depression, anxiety? Have there been any major stressors in your life recently?" I looked at this man who'd known me since childhood, who'd helped my family through the darkest period of our lives, and made a decision to trust him with the truth. "Dr. Thompson," I said, "can I tell you about my relationship with my stepmother?" For the next hour, I walked him through 18 months of gradually canceled plans, rescheduled dinners, and subtle suggestions that I was too dependent on family relationships. I showed him the text messages, played the voicemails, described the pattern of behavior that had culminated in Victoria's advice to build my own life. Dr. Thompson listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes in his careful handwriting. When I finished, he was quiet for several minutes. "Emma," he said finally, "what you're describing sounds less like depression, and more like a healthy response to emotional manipulation." The relief I felt at hearing those words was overwhelming. A medical professional, someone Dad trusted implicitly, was validating my perception of the situation. "Your father is genuinely worried about you," Dr. Thompson continued, "but his worry seems to be based on information that doesn't match your actual behavior or mental state. Someone has convinced him that normal independence is abnormal isolation." "What do I do?" I asked. "You continue doing exactly what you're doing," he said. "Live your life, pursue your career, maintain your friendships. Don't let anyone convince you that healthy boundaries are unhealthy behavior. And Dad, your father will have to decide whether he trusts his own knowledge of you or someone else's interpretation of you." Dr. Thompson said gently, "That's not your choice to make." Friday evening, I was putting the finishing touches on a website design, when Riley burst into my studio without knocking, face flushed with excitement. "Emma, you need to hear this," Riley said, pulling out her phone. "Mom had lunch with Mrs. Patterson today, and apparently there's been some interesting developments on Maple Street." Riley played a voice memo from her mother. So Patricia Patterson called me in quite a state today. Apparently, Michael Thompson came home from work yesterday, absolutely furious. She could hear him shouting from her kitchen window, which you know how thick those walls are. She couldn't make out most of it, but she distinctly heard him say something about lies and manipulations, and asking Victoria how she could do this to his daughter. Then this morning, Patricia saw Victoria loading suitcases into her car. When she asked if they were going on a trip, Victoria said she was staying at her sister's for a while, to let Michael think clearly. Patricia said she looked like she'd been crying. Riley stopped the recording and looked at me expectantly. What do you think happened? I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I think Dr. Thompson talked to Dad. You think he told your father what you told him? I think he asked Dad some very specific questions about my behavior, and Dad realized that his worry was based on someone else's interpretation rather than his own observations. Riley grinned. Victoria's story fell apart. Victoria's story required me to be unstable and dependent, I said. When I proved to be neither, and when an objective third party confirmed that my behavior was actually healthy, the narrative collapsed. So what happens now? Now Dad has to decide whether he wants a marriage based on manipulation or a relationship based on truth, I said, and I continue building the life I want regardless of what anyone else chooses. That night, I cooked myself an elaborate dinner, opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion, and sat by my windows watching the lights of Riverside twinkle below. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is all your fault. You destroyed my marriage." I deleted the message without responding. Victoria had taught me well. Some lessons are only valuable when you apply them correctly. Outside my window, the Riverside River continued its patient flow toward the sea, carving its path through the landscape with the kind of persistence that changes everything, one small push at a time. The next morning would bring consequences none of us had fully anticipated. But that night, sitting in my own space with my own thoughts and my own choices, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Mom died, the deep peace that comes from knowing that truth, like water, always finds its way to the surface. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing except be exactly who you are. Victoria had spent 18 months trying to reshape my father's perception of me, but she'd forgotten one crucial detail. Dad had known me for 24 years. Once someone reminded him to trust his own experience rather than someone else's interpretation, the house of cards was bound to fall. I raised my wine glass to the window, to the lights of the town where I'd grown up, to the memory of my mother, who taught me that truth has a way of surfacing, and to the lesson Victoria had unknowingly given me about the power of taking people at their word. "Thanks for the lesson," I whispered, and for the first time in months I meant it completely. Part 6-9. The truth emerges. Saturday morning brought with it the kind of silence that follows a storm, when the air feels cleared but everything looks different in the aftermath. I woke to 17 missed calls from Dad, all received between midnight and 3 in the morning. The timestamps told a story of someone wrestling with revelations in the dark hours when truth feels heaviest. I made coffee and sat cross-legged on my window seat, watching the early joggers make their way along the Riverside path below. Riverside had always been the kind of town where people dealt with personal crises quietly, behind closed doors, but somehow the whole community always seemed to sense when something significant had shifted. Mrs. Patterson was already in her garden, pruning roses with the focused intensity of someone who had urgent gossip to process. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Emma, I need to see you. Can you come to the house this morning? Please." The word please hit differently than it had in months. This wasn't the polite distance of a father being managed by his wife, this was the raw vulnerability of someone who'd discovered he'd been living inside a carefully constructed fiction. I texted back, "I'll be there in an hour." The drive to Maple Street felt different this time, like I was returning to a place I'd never really left but had been convinced I no longer belonged. The autumn maples that gave the street its name were in full glory, their leaves catching the morning light in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of the stained glass windows in the church where Mom and Dad had been married 26 years ago. Dad was waiting on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway, still in the clothes he'd worn to work the day before, looking like a man who'd spent the night examining the wreckage of his assumptions. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and there was a grayness to his complexion that reminded me uncomfortably of the weeks following Mom's diagnosis. "Emma," he said, standing as I walked up the path, "thank you for coming." "Of course, Dad." He gestured toward the porch swing where he and Mom used to sit on Sunday evenings, watching the neighborhood settle into the comfortable rhythm of another weekending. The swing looked smaller now, like it had been built for a different version of our family. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at the maple tree in the front yard that Mom had planted the year I started kindergarten. It had grown tall and strong, its branches now reaching toward the second-story windows, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. "I talked to Dr. Thompson yesterday," Dad said finally. "He told me you came to see him." "He came to see me, actually. You asked him to check on my mental health." Dad winced. "I was worried about you. Victoria said you'd been acting strangely, becoming isolated and unresponsive. She was concerned that you might be having some kind of breakdown." "And what did Dr. Thompson tell you?" "He asked me to describe specifically what behaviors I'd observed that seemed concerning." Dad's voice was quiet, almost wondering. When I started listing them, I realized that everything I was worried about was something Victoria had told me to worry about, not something I'd actually witnessed myself. The morning air carried the scent of wood smoke from someone's fireplace, mixing with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and the faint aroma of coffee from the cafe downtown. It was the smell of Riverside in autumn, familiar and comforting in a way that made the conversation feel both easier and more painful. "Dad," I said gently, "when was the last time you and I had a conversation without Victoria present or without her having input on the topic beforehand?" He was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I can't remember." "When was the last time you called me just to talk, not because Victoria suggested you should check on me?" Another long silence. "I can't remember that either." "When was the last time we made plans that didn't get cancelled or rescheduled for one of Victoria's events?" "Emma." He stopped, ran his hands through his hair in the gesture I remembered from childhood whenever he was trying to solve a particularly complex problem. How did I not see this? "Because she was very careful about it," I said. "She never openly discouraged our relationship. She just created circumstances where maintaining it became increasingly difficult, then reframed my normal reactions as concerning behavior." "The Saturday tax sessions," he said suddenly. "You used to come every Saturday to help with the quarterly reports. When did we stop doing that?" 4 months ago, Victoria started scheduling things for you on Saturday mornings, then expressing concern that I was too dependent on our weekly routine. Your birthday dinner, cancelled for the wine country trip. The Tuesday phone calls. You stopped calling after Victoria mentioned that it might be healthier for me to initiate contact when I actually needed something rather than out of habit. Dad buried his face in his hands. "My God, Emma. What have I done?" "You fell in love," I said simply. "You were grieving and lonely, and someone came along who made you feel better. You trusted her to help you navigate a situation you'd never been in before. That's not a character flaw, Dad. That's human. But I hurt you. I let her convince me that loving you was somehow holding you back from growing up." "You did hurt me," I agreed, "but not because you were malicious. Because you were vulnerable and someone took advantage of that vulnerability." The front door opened, and I tensed, expecting Victoria to emerge with her practiced smile and carefully crafted explanations. Instead, David, Dad's brother, stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been elected to provide moral support during a difficult conversation. "Morning, Emma," David said, offering me one of the cups. "Michael asked me to come over last night. Figured you both might need a neutral party to help sort through this mess." I accepted the coffee gratefully. David had always been the practical one in the family, the brother who asked direct questions and expected honest answers. If Dad had called him, it meant he was serious about understanding what had happened. "David," Dad said, "tell Emma what you told me last night about the family barbecue." David settled into one of the wicker chairs, his expression thoughtful. "The 4th of July barbecue this year. Emma, do you remember being invited?" "I wasn't invited," I said. "Victoria mentioned that it was going to be small, just immediate family and a few of her friends from the real estate office." "That's what she told you," David said. "But she told the rest of us that you were too busy with work to attend, that you'd specifically asked not to be included because you felt uncomfortable at family gatherings since your mom died." Dad's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. "What?" She said Emma was going through a phase where family events made her sad, and that we should give her space to process her grief without the pressure of social obligations. David continued. "She made it sound like including Emma would be cruel to Emma." "I never said any of that," I said, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "I love family gatherings. I've been looking forward to them since Mom died, because they're one of the few times I feel connected to everyone." "Victoria told different stories to different people," David said. "To you she suggested the gatherings were exclusive. To us she suggested you were excluding yourself. Everyone thought they were respecting Emma's wishes." Dad set his coffee cup down with shaking hands. "How many other times did this happen?" "Thanksgiving last year," David said. "Christmas Eve, Easter, Mom's birthday memorial dinner." Every time Victoria had a reason why Emma couldn't make it or wouldn't want to be there, and every time it sounded like she was protecting Emma's feelings. "But I kept asking you about these events," I said to Dad. "I kept mentioning that I hadn't heard anything about plans, and I kept thinking you were hinting that you wanted to be included, but Victoria assured me you were just being polite. She said you'd be relieved if I didn't pressure you to attend." The magnitude of the manipulation was breathtaking. Victoria hadn't just isolated me from Dad, she'd isolated me from the entire extended family while making everyone believe they were being considerate of my emotional needs. "There's more," David said quietly. "Michael, tell her about the college fund." Dad looked like he might be sick. "Your mother set aside money for your graduate school, if you ever decided to pursue a master's degree. It's been sitting in an account earning interest since she died." "Okay," I said, not sure where this was leading. "Victoria suggested that giving it to you now might enable your dependence on family financial support. She thought it would be healthier to let you fund your own education when you were ready, to help you build genuine independence. She convinced you not to tell me about money Mom had specifically saved for my education. She made it sound like we'd be doing you a disservice by making things too easy for you." I felt something cold and sharp settling in my chest. "Dad, what else haven't you told me that Mom intended for me to have?" Dad exchanged a look with David that made my stomach drop. "Emma, there are some things we need to discuss about your mother's wishes. Things that Victoria suggested we handle differently than Lisa had originally planned." "What things?" "Mom's jewelry, her books, the hope chest she'd been filling for your wedding someday. Victoria thought it might be too painful for you to inherit these things right after the funeral, that it would be healthier to wait until you were emotionally ready." "It's been 3 years, Dad. When exactly was I supposed to become emotionally ready?" "Victoria kept saying you seemed too fragile to handle reminders of your—" Every time I mentioned giving you Lisa's things, she'd point out how sad you got whenever Mom was mentioned in conversation. "I got sad because I missed her," not because I couldn't handle having her belongings. Those things would have comforted me, not traumatized me. David cleared his throat. Emma, there's something else. The house. What about the house? Dad looked like he was aging in real time. Your mother's will specified that if anything happened to me, the house would go to you. But Victoria suggested that we update my will to reflect our new family situation. She thought it would be unfair to burden you with property maintenance and taxes when you're just starting your Victoria, she convinced you to change your will. She made it sound like we were protecting you from financial responsibility you weren't ready for. The scope of Victoria's long-term planning was staggering. She hadn't just been manipulating daily interactions, she'd been systematically removing my connection to Mom's memory and my future security, all while making it seem like she was protecting my best interests. Where is Victoria now? I asked. Staying at her sister Diane's house, Dad said. She left yesterday afternoon after I confronted her about the stories she'd been telling. She said she needed space to think about our marriage. What did she say when you asked her about the manipulation? Dad's laugh was bitter. She denied manipulating anyone. She said she'd been trying to help our family heal and grow, and that she was hurt. I would question her motives after everything she'd done for us. Even when presented with specific examples, she had explanations for everything. The cancelled plans were coincidences. The family events were miscommunications. The will changes were practical decisions. According to Victoria, she's been nothing but supportive and caring, and any problems in our family were due to my inability to let go of the past and your inability to accept change. She's rewriting history even now, I said. That's what Dr. Thompson said. He called it gaslighting. Making someone question their own perception of reality by consistently presenting an alternative version of events. We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us processing the weight of revelations that changed everything we thought we knew about the past 18 months. The morning was warming up, and neighbors were beginning to emerge for their weekend yard work, creating the familiar soundtrack of suburban Saturday mornings. Dad, I said eventually, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry with you for falling in love again. I'm not angry with you for wanting companionship after Mom died. What hurt was feeling like loving me had become incompatible with loving Victoria, like there wasn't room in your life for both relationships. There should have been room, he said. There was room. Victoria just convinced me there wasn't. The question now is what you want to do with this information. Dad looked at me with an expression I remembered from my childhood, when he was trying to solve problems that seemed too complex for easy solutions. What do you think I should do? I think you should decide what kind of life you want to live, and what kind of relationships you want to have. Then you should pursue those things regardless of who approves or disapproves. I want my daughter back, he said simply. I want the relationship we had before I let someone else define it for me. I'm right here, Dad. I've been here the whole time. David stood up, gathering the empty coffee cups. I'm going to leave you two to talk. Michael, think about what we discussed last night. Emma, it's good to have you back where you belong. After David left, Dad and I walked through the house together for the first time in months. Victoria's decorating changes were subtle but pervasive, like a different language slowly replacing the one you grew up speaking. Mom's favorite throw pillows had been replaced with ones in Victoria's preferred color scheme. The bookshelf that used to hold Mom's collection of gardening books now displayed Victoria's real estate awards. The kitchen windowsill where Mom had kept her herb garden now held a decorative vase that served no functional purpose. I didn't realize how much had changed, Dad said, running his finger along the empty windowsill. It happened gradually, I said. That's what made it so effective. If she'd tried to erase all traces of Mom at once, you would have noticed and objected. But one small change at a time, each one justified as making the space more comfortable for everyone, and eventually the house became hers instead of ours. We ended up in Dad's office, where he pulled out a file cabinet I'd never seen before. Victoria suggested I organize all the legal documents in one place for better estate planning. I thought it was practical. He opened the cabinet and showed me the updated will, the insurance policy beneficiary changes, and a stack of documents I didn't recognize. She was very thorough about modernizing our financial arrangements. Dad, you need to have an independent attorney review all of these changes. Not the lawyer Victoria recommended, someone else entirely. I already called Jim Morrison this morning. He's going to come over Monday to go through everything. Jim Morrison had been the family lawyer since before I was born, someone who'd known our family through good times and difficult ones. If anyone could untangle the legal implications of Victoria's modernization, it would be him. There's something else, Dad said, pulling out a folder from the bottom drawer. Victoria had me sign papers giving her power of attorney in case of medical emergencies. She said it was standard for married couples, but now I'm wondering what other decisions she could make on my behalf. The power of attorney documents were comprehensive, giving Victoria authority over financial and medical decisions in a wide range of circumstances. It was exactly the kind of legal framework someone would need to systematically control another person's life, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Dad, you need to revoke these immediately. Jim's bringing the paperwork Monday. We spent the rest of the morning going through Mom's belongings that Victoria had convinced Dad to store until I was ready for them. Box after box of treasures I'd assumed were lost forever. Mom's jewelry, her recipe collection, the quilt she'd been working on when she got sick, photo albums from my childhood, and the hope chest she'd been filling since I was a teenager with things she wanted me to have when I got married someday. Opening the hope chest was like receiving a letter from beyond the grave. Mom had included handwritten notes explaining the significance of each item: her grandmother's china for special occasions, linens she'd embroidered during my first year of college, a set of Christmas ornaments she'd collected over the years with plans to pass them down to the next generation. At the bottom of the chest was an envelope with my name in Mom's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just a few weeks before she died. My dearest Emma, it began, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you these things myself. I want you to know that being your mother has been the greatest joy of my life. You are strong and smart and kind, and I know you will build a beautiful life for yourself. I also know that your father will find love again someday, and I hope you will welcome that person into our family with an open heart. But Emma, never let anyone convince you that loving someone new means loving you less. There is always room for more love in a family, never less. If anyone tries to tell you otherwise, trust your own heart and remember that you belong wherever love is genuine. All my love always, Mom. I read the letter twice before I could speak. She knew you would remarry. She encouraged me to, Dad said quietly. She made me promise not to spend the rest of my life alone, but she also made it clear that new love shouldn't diminish existing love. Victoria convinced me that holding on to the past was preventing me from building a future, but Mom's letter says the opposite. She wanted me to build a future that included the past, not replaced it. That's the difference between healthy love and controlling love, I said. Healthy love adds to your life. Controlling love subtracts from it. Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter in my hands. Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Okay, do you think I can fix this? Do you think we can rebuild what we had before I let Victoria tear it down? Our relationship was never broken, it was just buried under someone else's agenda. Now that we know what happened, we can choose how to move forward. I want to move forward with you in my life. Whatever that means for my marriage, whatever choices I have to make, I want you to know that you come first. You've always come first, even when I lost sight of that. I want that too, Dad, but I also want you to understand that I'm not the same person I was 18 months ago. I've learned to be independent, to make my own decisions, to trust my own judgment. I can't go back to being the daughter who needed your approval for everything. I don't want you to go back. I want you to move forward as the woman you've become, and I want to be part of that journey if you'll let me. Then we figure it out together, I said, one honest conversation at a time. That afternoon we drove to Pine Grove Cemetery and sat beside Mom's grave together for the first time since the funeral. Dad brought fresh flowers, and I brought the letter she'd written, reading it aloud, to the woman who'd somehow known exactly what we would need to hear 3 years after she was gone. I think she would be proud of how you handled this, Dad said as we prepared to leave. I think she would be proud of both of us for finding our way back to each other. Emma, there's one more thing I need to tell you. What's that? Victoria left her ring on the kitchen counter when she packed her things yesterday. I think she knew this marriage was over before I did. How do you feel about that? Dad was quiet for a moment, looking at the headstone that marked the place where our family's foundation was buried, but not lost. I feel like I'm finally waking up from a very long, very confusing dream, and now I want to build the life your mother envisioned for us. A life where love multiplies instead of divides, where new relationships enhance existing ones instead of replacing them. That sounds like a good place to start. As we drove back toward town, I realized that Victoria had ultimately given me exactly what she'd promised, a lesson about building my own life. She just hadn't anticipated that the lesson would include learning to recognize manipulation, trust my own perceptions, and understand the difference between love that liberates and love that controls. The sunset painted the Riverside mountains in shades of gold and amber, reminding me of the stained glass windows in Mom's favorite church, where light transforms ordinary glass into something beautiful and sacred. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not through dramatic confrontations or explosive revelations, but through the simple act of refusing to accept someone else's version of your reality. Victoria had spent 18 months trying to rewrite our family's story, but she'd forgotten that the best stories are the ones written by the people who actually live them. And our story, the real one, was just beginning its next chapter. Parts 10 Mitro 14, Resolution and New Beginnings. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity that follows a weekend of difficult truths. I woke in my loft feeling different, not lighter, exactly, but more solid, like I'd finally stopped floating and found firm ground beneath my feet. The October light streaming through my windows carried a quality I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time in 18 months. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Dad, all from early morning, but these felt different from the worried calls of the past week. These felt like the calls of someone who had work to do and wanted to include me in the process. I called him back while making coffee in the French press that had become part of my morning ritual of independence. Emma, he answered on the first ring. Thank you for calling back. Jim Morrison is coming over at 10 to review all the legal documents Victoria had me sign. Would you like to be here for that? Do you want me there? I want you involved in every decision that affects our family from now on. If you're comfortable with that, I'll be there. The drive to Maple Street felt different this time, like I was returning to a place that was being reclaimed rather than revisited. Dad was waiting on the front porch again, but this time he looked like someone who'd slept. Someone who'd made decisions in the clear light of morning rather than the confused darkness of 3 a.m. revelations. Jim Morrison's silver Honda was already in the driveway, and through the front window I could see him setting up stacks of papers on the dining room table, with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years untangling other people's legal complications. Emma, Jim said when I walked in, offering his familiar firm handshake, good to see you. Your father's been filling me in on the situation. Quite a mess, but nothing we can't sort out. The dining room table looked like the aftermath of a paper explosion. Documents were organized in neat piles with sticky notes and colored tabs, creating a map of 18 months of legal manipulation disguised as helpful organization. Let's start with the big picture, Jim said, settling into his chair and opening a yellow legal pad covered in notes. Victoria had your father sign papers giving her power of attorney for both financial and medical decisions. That's not automatically problematic for married couples, but the scope of authority in these documents is unusually broad. Dad shifted uncomfortably. What do you mean by broad? Most spousal power of attorney documents limit authority to genuine emergencies or incapacitation. These documents give Victoria authority to make major financial decisions, healthcare choices, and even real estate transactions without requiring proof of your inability to make those decisions yourself. Could she have sold the house without my knowledge? Dad asked. With these documents, yes, she could have refinanced it, taken out home equity loans, or transferred ownership to herself under the right circumstances. I felt a chill. Were there any circumstances that would have triggered that authority? Jim flipped through several pages. There's a clause here that's particularly concerning. It gives Victoria decision-making authority if a licensed physician determines that Michael is experiencing significant emotional distress that impairs judgment. That's not a standard medical emergency clause. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked. It means that if Victoria could convince a doctor that your father was too grief-stricken or emotionally unstable to make sound decisions, she could take over his finances legally. Dad looked pale. She kept suggesting I see someone about my grief. She said I was having trouble moving forward, that I might benefit from counseling or medication to help me process my emotions. Did she recommend any specific healthcare providers? Jim asked. Dr. Whitman, a psychiatrist who specializes in grief counseling. Victoria made the appointment for me, said Dr. Thompson had recommended him. Jim made a note. I'll need to check if Dr. Thompson actually made that recommendation. Emma, did your father ever seem emotionally unstable to you during this period? He seemed sad and sometimes confused about family dynamics, but never unstable. Never unable to make rational decisions about his business or daily life. That matches my observations, Jim said. Michael, you've been handling complex financial matters for your clients throughout this entire period without any issues. Your emotional state, while understandably complicated by grief and remarriage, never appeared to impair your professional judgment. So the power of attorney was unnecessary. The power of attorney was potentially dangerous, Jim corrected. Victoria had legal authority to make decisions that could have fundamentally altered your financial security and property ownership, justified by a very subjective assessment of your emotional state. Jim moved to the next stack of papers. Now let's look at the will changes. Your original will left everything to Emma in the event of your death, with provisions for her education and support. The updated will divides your estate between Victoria and Emma, with Victoria receiving the house and primary assets, and Emma receiving a smaller monetary inheritance. Victoria said it would be unfair to burden Emma with property maintenance and taxes, Dad said. That might be a reasonable concern if Emma were a minor or financially incapable, Jim said. But Emma is 24, college-educated and running her own business. She's perfectly capable of deciding whether she wants to inherit property or sell it and use the proceeds for other purposes. What else? I asked, sensing there was more. The insurance beneficiaries were changed from Emma to Victoria. The retirement account beneficiaries were changed from Emma to Victoria. Even the small life insurance policy Michael has through his business was changed from Emma to Victoria. Dad buried his face in his hands. She said it was standard to update beneficiaries after marriage, that it would be strange not to include my wife in my estate planning. Including a spouse in estate planning is normal, Jim said. Excluding your only child entirely is not. Most people in your situation would split assets between spouse and children, or leave the spouse a life estate in the house with the property ultimately going to the children. How do we fix this? I asked. We revoke everything, Jim said simply. The power of attorney, the will changes, the beneficiary. We start over with documents that reflect your actual wishes rather than someone else's interpretation of what your wishes should be. Can Victoria challenge the revocations? Dad asked. She can try, but she'd have to prove that the changes were made under duress or without proper mental capacity. Given that you're clearly competent and making these decisions with legal counsel present, that would be difficult to argue. We spent the next 2 hours going through each document, with Jim explaining what each change meant and what the original provisions had been. The scope of Victoria's legal maneuvering was breathtaking. She'd systematically positioned herself to inherit everything while making it seem like she was simply updating outdated paperwork. "Jim," I said as we neared the end of the review, "is this level of legal manipulation normal in second marriages? It's not uncommon for new spouses to want some security, but this goes well beyond normal spousal protections. This looks like someone who came into the marriage with a plan to acquire assets." "You think she married him for money?" I asked. "I think she married him for control," Jim said. "The money was secondary to the power to make decisions that would benefit her long term." After Jim left with a briefcase full of documents to revise, Dad and I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and trying to process the magnitude of what we'd learned. "Emma," Dad said eventually, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay, do you think Victoria loved me at all, or was this entire relationship calculated from the beginning?" I considered the question seriously. Over 18 months, I'd watched Victoria interact with Dad in private moments, seen her responses to his stories and his grief, observed the way she handled his emotions and his needs. "I think she cared about you," I said finally, "but I also think she saw you as a project to be managed rather than a person to be partnered with. She wanted to create a version of you that fit her vision of what a husband should be, and that included removing the parts of your life that didn't serve her purposes. Including you, including me, including your relationship with David, including your connection to Mom's memory, including your independence in making decisions about your own life. She wasn't trying to join our family, she was trying to replace it with a family where she was the center and everyone else orbited around her preferences." Dad was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup like it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "The divorce," he said eventually. "She'll fight it, won't she?" "Probably. But Jim says Oregon is a no-fault state, which means you don't have to prove wrongdoing to get divorced. You just have to prove that the marriage can't be fixed." "Can it be fixed? Do you want it to be fixed?" Dad looked around the kitchen, taking in the changes Victoria had made, the warmth she'd removed, the functionality she'd replaced with decoration. "I want my life back," he said. "I want to make decisions based on what I think is right, not what someone else thinks I should think is right. I want to love people without having to justify that love or limit it to make someone else comfortable." "Then you know what you need to do. I need to ask you something else, and this one might be harder to answer." "What's that?" "Can you forgive me? Not just for the specific things that happened, but for letting someone convince me to love you less, for choosing comfort over truth when the truth got complicated." The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of 18 months of cancelled plans and forgotten traditions and small betrayals disguised as practical decisions. "Dad," I said, "you didn't choose to love me less. You chose to trust someone who convinced you that loving me differently was loving me better. Those aren't the same thing. But the result was the same. You were hurt. Our relationship was damaged. Our relationship was buried, not destroyed, and now we're digging it out together. What if we can't get back to where we were? Maybe we're not supposed to get back to where we were. Maybe we're supposed to build something new that's stronger because we've learned what we're capable of surviving." That afternoon, Victoria called Dad's phone while we were going through more of Mom's belongings. Dad looked at the caller ID, then at me. "Answer it," I said, "but put it on speaker." Victoria's voice filled the kitchen, crisp and controlled, despite the underlying tension. "Michael, I think we need to talk. This situation has gotten out of hand." "What situation is that, Victoria?" "You know what situation. You've been listening to people who don't understand our marriage, making decisions based on emotions instead of logic. I think you're having trouble processing everything that's happened." "What's happened, Victoria?" Your daughter has been manipulating you, turning you against me because she can't accept that you've moved on from her mother. She's threatened by our happiness, and she's using your grief to drive a wedge between us. I started to respond, but Dad held up his hand. Victoria, he said calmly, I've reviewed all the legal documents you had me sign. I've spoken with Dr. Thompson about your concerns regarding Emma's mental health. I've talked with my family about the stories you told them regarding Emma's availability for family events. Michael, you're not thinking clearly. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment, which is exactly what I was trying to protect you from. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 18 months. The question is whether you want to have an honest conversation about what's been happening in our marriage, or whether you want to continue telling me that my perceptions are wrong. I've never told you your perceptions were wrong. I've helped you see situations more objectively, helped you make decisions that were in your best interest and Emma's best interest. Whose best interest was it to change my will without discussing it with me first? We did discuss it. You agreed that it made sense to update your estate planning to reflect our marriage. Whose best interest was it to give you power of attorney with such broad authority that you could have made major financial decisions without my knowledge? That was for your protection, in case your grief interfered with your ability to make sound choices. Dad looked at me across the table, and I could see him hearing Victoria's words clearly for the first time. Every answer was a justification that positioned her as the responsible adult, protecting him from his own poor judgment. Victoria, Dad said, I'm filing for divorce. The papers will be served this week. Michael, you're making a mistake. You're letting Emma poison your mind against me because she can't stand to see you happy. I'm making a decision based on my own observations and my own values. This marriage has required me to love my daughter less in order to make you comfortable, and that's not a compromise I'm willing to make. I never asked you to love Emma less. You asked me to trust your interpretation of her behavior over my own knowledge of her character. You asked me to prioritize your comfort over her inclusion. You asked me to believe that 18 months of problems were caused by her inability to accept change rather than your unwillingness to share space. She's manipulated you into believing a false narrative about our relationship. Emma's been building her own life exactly as you suggested she should. She's been independent, respectful, and honest about her feelings. The person who's been manipulating narratives is you. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become sharper, more desperate. If you divorce me, I'll fight for everything. The house, the retirement accounts, the business assets. I'll make this as expensive and painful as possible. That's your choice to make, Dad said. But the legal documents you had me sign are being revoked, so you won't have the authority you thought you had. You'll regret this, Michael. You're choosing a daughter who will move on with her own life over a wife who was devoted to building a future with you. I'm choosing truth over control. I'm choosing relationships based on mutual respect over relationships based on manipulation. Emma, are you listening to this? Are you proud of yourself for destroying your father's marriage? I leaned toward the phone. Victoria, I'm proud of myself for taking your advice. You told me to build my own life and stop depending on family relationships for happiness. That's exactly what I did. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I know exactly what you meant. You meant that I should disappear from Dad's life so you could have complete control over his decisions and his emotions. But what you taught me instead was how to recognize manipulation and how to trust my own perceptions, even when someone is telling me they're wrong. You're a vindictive little girl who can't stand to see your father with someone other than your precious dead mother. I'm a grown woman who learned to distinguish between love that adds to a family and love that subtracts from it. Thank you for the lesson. Victoria hung up without another word. Dad and I sat in the quiet kitchen for several minutes, processing the conversation and what it revealed about the person he'd been married to for 12 months. She really believes her own story, Dad said finally. I think she has to believe it. If she acknowledged that she was manipulating us, she'd have to face what that says about who she is as a person. Do you think she ever loved me? I think she loved the idea of you. A successful, financially stable man who was vulnerable enough to be guided, who had a beautiful house and an established place in the community. But love requires accepting someone as they are, including their relationships and their history and their independent thoughts. She wanted to edit me, she wanted to manage you. There's a difference between supporting someone through difficulties and controlling their responses to those difficulties. That evening, Dad and I drove to Sunset Cafe for dinner, something we hadn't done together since before Victoria entered our lives. Miguel greeted us with surprise and genuine warmth, seating us at the corner table where Mom used to like to sit so she could watch the river through the large windows. "It's good to see you two together again," Miguel said as he brought our coffee. "Your father's been worried about you, Emma. He was in here several times, asking if I'd seen you, if you seemed okay." Victoria had convinced him I was having emotional problems, I said. "Victoria," Miguel said, and something in his tone made me look up. "The real estate lady, with the expensive handbags, you know her. She came in here a few times, always asking questions about your family, wanted to know how often you and your father used to meet here, whether you seemed close, how you handled your mother's death. Said she was trying to understand the family dynamics to be a better stepmother." Dad and I exchanged glances. "What kind of questions?" Dad asked. "Personal questions, about Emma's relationships, her work, her social life, whether she'd ever seemed jealous of other women in your life, whether she had trouble accepting change." "What did you tell her?" "I told her Emma was one of the most level-headed young women I knew, that you two had always been close, and that she'd handled her mother's death with incredible grace and maturity." How did Victoria respond to that? She seemed disappointed, like she'd been hoping for different information. She kept pushing for examples of Emma being difficult or emotional, and when I couldn't provide any, she suggested that maybe Emma hid her problems well. She was building a case, I said to Dad, gathering ammunition for the narrative she was constructing. "What narrative?" Miguel asked. "That Emma was emotionally unstable and too dependent on family relationships," Dad said. "Victoria convinced me that Emma needed distance from me to grow up properly." Miguel looked genuinely confused. "Emma's been independent since she was 16. She moved out, started her own business, built her own life. If anything, I always thought she was maybe too independent, like she was trying not to burden you with her normal needs for family connection." "That's exactly what she was doing," Dad said quietly. "Because Victoria had convinced me that those needs were unhealthy." We talked through dinner about the past 18 months, with Miguel occasionally adding observations from his perspective, as someone who'd known our family for years. His outside view confirmed what we'd already realized. Victoria's concerns about my emotional state and dependence had no basis in observable reality. "You know what's interesting?" Miguel said, as he brought our dessert. "Victoria stopped coming in here about 6 months ago, right around the time Emma started coming in alone, instead of with you, Michael." "Why do you think that was?" I asked. "I think she realized I wasn't going to validate her story about Emma being problematic. She needed people who would confirm her narrative, and I was never going to do that." After dinner, Dad and I walked along the Riverside path that ran behind the cafe, something we used to do regularly when I was in high school and we needed to talk through complicated decisions or difficult emotions. "Emma," Dad said, as we reached the bench where we used to sit when the conversations got too heavy for walking, "I need to tell you something about the divorce." "What's that?" "It's going to be messy. Victoria's going to try to make me look unstable or incompetent, like I'm making emotional decisions under your influence rather than rational decisions based on my own observations." "Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to tell the truth about what happened and let the legal system sort out the rest, but I want you to know that whatever Victoria claims about you during this process, whatever stories she tells to try to discredit your character or your motives, I won't believe them." "I know, Dad, do you?" Because for 18 months, I did believe her stories about you. I chose her interpretation over my own knowledge of who you are. You believed someone you loved and trusted when she told you things that seemed plausible. That's not a character flaw, but I hurt you in the process. And now you're choosing truth over comfort, even though the truth is complicated and painful. That's not a character flaw either. We sat on the bench, watching the river flow past, carrying fallen leaves toward the distant ocean, each piece of the forest eventually finding its way to something larger and more enduring. Mom would be proud of us, I said eventually, for surviving this, for learning from it, for choosing each other over the easier path of accepting a false peace. What do you think she would say about Victoria? I thought about Mom's letter, about her hopes for Dad's future happiness, and her certainty that love multiplies rather than divides. I think she would say that Victoria taught us both important lessons about the difference between love and control, between support and manipulation, and I think she would say that those lessons, however painful, made us stronger and wiser. Do you believe that? I believe that Victoria came into our lives when we were both vulnerable, and she tried to use that vulnerability to reshape us into people who served her purposes, but she underestimated our foundation. She underestimated the strength of what you and Mom built together, and what you and I built together. She underestimated you. She underestimated both of us. She thought grief made us weak and manipulable, but it actually made us more capable of recognizing authentic love versus counterfeit love. Dad reached over and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a child. Emma, I want you to know that whatever happens with the divorce, whatever legal complications arise, whatever stories Victoria tells about our family, you are my priority. You have always been my priority, even when I lost sight of that. I know, Dad, and I want you to know that I don't need you to choose between loving me and finding companionship. I need you to choose people who enhance your ability to love rather than limit it. That's the difference, isn't it? Between Victoria and what a real partner would be like. A real partner would have wanted to know me, to include me, to build something together, rather than to replace what already existed. We walked home in comfortable silence, both of us understanding that the hardest part was behind us. The legal proceedings would be complicated, the social dynamics in Riverside would be awkward for a while, and there would be practical challenges to untangle, but we had our foundation back, and everything else could be built from there. 3 weeks later, I was working in my studio when Dad called with news that Victoria had agreed to an uncontested divorce. In exchange for a modest financial settlement, she would keep her personal belongings and the car she'd purchased after their marriage, but the house, the retirement accounts, and the business assets would remain with Dad. She decided it wasn't worth fighting. I asked, Jim thinks she realized that the power of attorney documents were going to be scrutinized in court, and that the evidence of manipulation would damage her credibility in other areas of her life. Her real estate business, and her social standing in the community. Riverside is a small town. If it came out in court that she'd systematically isolated a stepdaughter while manipulating legal documents to gain financial control, that reputation would follow her. So she's moving away, back to California, where she came from. She's selling her share of the real estate office to her partner. How do you feel about that? Relieved, Dad said, without hesitation, and grateful that it's ending without a prolonged legal battle. And how do you feel about being single again? Dad was quiet for a moment, hopeful. He said finally, I feel like I have my life back, and now I can decide what to do with it based on my own values and priorities. That weekend, Dad and I hosted our first family dinner in over a year. David came with his wife and teenagers. Mrs. Patterson joined us with a casserole that tasted like childhood, and Miguel closed the cafe early to bring dessert and stay for coffee. We used Mom's china, the set Victoria had relegated to the top shelf because it was too formal for everyday use. We told stories about Mom, laughed about family memories that Victoria had suggested were dwelling on the past, and made plans for holidays that would honor our traditions while creating new ones. You know what's funny? David said, as we were clearing the dishes. This feels more like a celebration than like recovery. What do you mean? I asked. I mean, we're not just getting back to where we were before Victoria, we're somewhere new, that's actually better, because we understand what we value, and why we value it. We're more intentional now, Dad agreed. Before Victoria, we took our family relationships for granted. Now we know how precious they are, and how easily they can be damaged by someone who doesn't understand their value, or someone who sees them as obstacles to control, I added. That night, I sat in my loft writing in the journal I'd started keeping throughout the ordeal. Not because I needed to process trauma, but because I wanted to remember the lessons learned, and the strength discovered. Victoria taught me that I am capable of recognizing manipulation, even when it's disguised as care. I wrote. She taught me that taking someone's advice, and using it authentically, can be more powerful than arguing with them. She taught me that truth really does surface when you stop trying to force it down. Most importantly, she taught me that love that requires you to diminish other relationships isn't love at all. 6 months later, Dad started dating again. This time, he introduced me to Sarah early in the relationship, included me in group activities, and chose someone who was curious about our family history rather than threatened by it. Sarah asked questions about Mom with genuine interest, admired the family photos that Dad had returned to their prominent places, and brought her own stories and traditions to share, rather than trying to replace ours. She's different, I told Riley over coffee one Saturday morning. Different how? She adds to Dad's life without subtracting from it. When they make plans, she asks if I'd like to join. When they talk about the future, it includes maintaining the relationships and traditions that matter to Dad. She sounds like what Victoria pretended to be. She is what Victoria pretended to be. The real thing versus the counterfeit. How does your dad seem? Happy, but also wiser. He asks different questions now, pays attention to different things. He's learned to trust his own instincts about people, instead of just hoping for the best. And you? How are you with all this? Good, I said, and meant it completely. I like Sarah, but more importantly, I like who Dad is when he's with her. She brings out the best parts of him, instead of trying to manage the parts she doesn't understand. That's the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, isn't it? Victoria wanted to create a version of Dad that fit her vision of what a husband should be. Sarah appreciates the version of Dad that already exists, and wants to build a life that includes all the parts of him, including his role as my father. A year after Victoria left, Dad and Sarah invited me to their engagement dinner at Sunset Cafe. Not a surprise party or a formal announcement, just a quiet celebration with the people who mattered most. Miguel decorated our corner table with flowers from his garden, Mrs. Patterson brought a homemade cake, and David gave a toast that made everyone cry happy tears. To second chances, David said, raising his glass, and to the wisdom to recognize real love when it finally arrives. To family that grows instead of shrinks, Dad added, to lessons learned and strength discovered, I said, to the future we're building together, Sarah concluded. As we walked home that evening, Sarah linking her arm through Dad's, while I walked beside them, I thought about the letter Mom had written about love multiplying rather than dividing. She had been right about so many things, but especially about Dad finding love again, and about there always being room for more genuine love in a family. Victoria had tried to teach me that love was a finite resource, that Dad's affection for a new wife required less affection for his daughter. But the real lesson was the opposite. Love that diminishes other relationships isn't love at all, and authentic love creates space for more connection, not less. Emma, Sarah said as we reached the house, thank you for being so welcoming to me. I know it can't be easy to watch your father start over again. Thank you for understanding that loving him means loving the whole package, including his history and his existing relationships. Those aren't obstacles to our happiness, Sarah said. They're the foundation that makes him the man I fell in love with. That night, I updated my journal with a final entry about the Victoria chapter of our lives. Some people come into your life to teach you what love looks like, and some people come to teach you what love doesn't look like. both lessons are valuable, but the second one might be more important because it helps you recognize and appreciate the real thing when it arrives. Victoria taught me that manipulation often disguises itself as care, that control often presents itself as protection, and that the most dangerous lies are the ones wrapped in concern for your well-being. But she also taught me that I am stronger than I knew, that truth really does surface when you stop fighting it, and that saying thanks for the lessons with genuine gratitude can be the most powerful response to someone who tried to diminish you. I am grateful for the hard lesson because it prepared me to recognize and celebrate the authentic love that followed. 2 years later, at Dad and Sarah's wedding, I served as the maid of honor while wearing Mom's pearl necklace and carrying a bouquet that included flowers from her garden. The ceremony took place in the backyard of the house on Maple Street, under the maple tree Mom had planted when I started kindergarten. During his vows, Dad thanked Sarah for loving him enough to include his whole life, including his memories, his family, and his dreams. Sarah thanked Dad for showing her what it means to love someone completely, including the people and experiences that shaped them. Emma, Sarah said, turning to me during her vows, thank you for showing me what it means to be part of a family that chooses love over fear, truth over comfort, and connection over control. As I watched them exchange rings under Mom's tree, surrounded by family and friends who had supported us through the difficult years and celebrated with us through the healing ones, I understood that Victoria's most valuable lesson had been unintentional. She had taught us all what authentic love looks like by showing us its opposite. The reception lasted until sunset, with dancing on the patio where Victoria had once suggested I was too dependent on family relationships. Children ran through the garden where Mom's flowers still bloomed each spring, their laughter mixing with the sounds of conversation and celebration. You know what I realized today? I told Riley as we watched Dad and Sarah's first dance. What's that? Victoria didn't destroy our family, she revealed how strong our foundation really was. When someone tried to tear us apart, we discovered we were built to last. And now you get to build something new on that same foundation. We all do, I said, watching Dad spin Sarah under the string lights we'd hung from the maple branches. That's the best part. The foundation is strong enough to support whatever we want to build next. Later that evening, as the guests departed and Sarah went inside to change out of her wedding dress, Dad and I sat on the porch swing where this whole journey had begun, with difficult conversations and painful revelations. Emma, he said, I need to tell you something. What's that? When Victoria left and I realized how much damage had been done to our relationship, I wasn't sure we'd be able to rebuild it. I was afraid I'd lost your trust permanently. What changed your mind? You did. The way you handled everything with grace and wisdom, the way you forgave without making me grovel, the way you supported my relationship with Sarah even though you had every reason to be skeptical of my judgment in romantic relationships. Dad, you raised me to believe that love is about choosing each other every day, not just once. Victoria tried to convince us both that family love was a burden, but it's actually the thing that gives us the strength to take risks and trust again. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. She would be proud of the man you've remained, despite someone's best efforts to change you into something smaller. And she would love Sarah. She does love Sarah, I said, looking up at the star-filled Oregon sky. Love like Mom's doesn't die just because the person does. It lives on in the choices we make and the people we become. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of Sarah moving around inside the house that was now truly her home, watching the lights come on in windows across the neighborhood where people were settling into their own version of family happiness. Dad, I said as we prepared to go inside, thank you for choosing truth over comfort when the truth got complicated. Thank you for teaching me the difference between love that liberates and love that controls. Victoria taught us both that lesson. No, Dad said, standing and offering me his hand. Victoria provided the contrast. You taught me the lesson by showing me what authentic love looks like, even when it's not easy or convenient. As we walked into the house together, I realized that the story that had begun with Victoria's manipulation had ultimately become a story about the power of authentic relationships to survive attempts at destruction. We had learned that truth really does surface, that love really does multiply when it's genuine, and that the strongest families are the ones that choose each other consciously rather than just accepting each other by default. Victoria had given me exactly what she'd promised, a lesson about building my own life. She just hadn't anticipated that the lesson would include learning to recognize my own worth, trust my own perceptions, and understand that healthy love enhances rather than diminishes the people it touches. Thanks for the lesson, I whispered one more time, and meant it with my whole heart. 5 years had passed since Victoria walked out of our lives, taking her suitcases and carefully constructed narratives with her. Riverside had settled back into its familiar rhythms, but sometimes on crisp October mornings like this one, I still thought about the woman who had tried so hard to teach me my place in the world. Sarah knocked on my apartment door carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone with news. Over the years, Sarah had become not just my stepmother but a genuine friend who understood that family relationships work best when they grow organically rather than being forced. "Emma," she said, settling into the chair by my window, "I got a call yesterday from a woman named Jennifer Walsh. She said she was Victoria's sister-in-law." The word carried familiar weight, bringing back memories of those 18 months when every conversation felt loaded with hidden meanings. What did she want? Sarah pulled out her phone. She'd heard about what happened here in Riverside, and she wanted to warn me. "Warn you about what?" "According to Jennifer, Victoria has a pattern. This isn't the first time she's targeted a widowed man with assets and an adult child who might inherit." I felt my coffee grow cold as Sarah continued. Jennifer's brother-in-law had been married for 30 years before his wife died of cancer. 6 months after the funeral, Victoria appeared at his grief support group. Within 8 months she'd moved in, within a year they were married, and immediately she began what Jennifer called the isolation campaign. The daughter found herself gradually excluded from family events, her concerns dismissed as jealousy. Victoria convinced the father his daughter was emotionally unstable, too dependent on family relationships. She had him change his will, update beneficiaries, sign power of attorney documents. When confronted with evidence of financial manipulation, Victoria agreed to a quiet divorce in exchange for cash. "And then she came to Riverside," I said. According to Jennifer, Riverside was Victoria's third attempt. She'd tried the same pattern in 2 other towns before she found your father. It hadn't been personal emotion or even simple greed, it had been a systematic approach to acquiring financial security by exploiting vulnerable men and eliminating family relationships that might interfere. "She's doing it again," Sarah said. "Victoria is engaged to a widower in Portland named Robert Chen. He has 2 adult sons and owns a successful restaurant chain." That afternoon, we sat in Dad's kitchen, where Victoria had once convinced him I was unstable. Dad listened with focused attention as Sarah explained Jennifer's call. "3 other families," he said when she finished. "At least 3 other families she'd manipulated before us. The grief support group where we met," Dad said slowly. "She wasn't there because she was grieving, she was hunting." According to Jennifer, Victoria studied obituaries and community announcements, then positioned herself to meet widowed men in settings where her presence seemed natural. She knew about Mom's death, about the house, Dad's business, about me, before she ever introduced herself. "She researched us," I said, "that first dinner when she knew things about our family you hadn't told her. She'd done her homework." Sarah reached across the table. "Emma, there's something else Jennifer told me about the other daughters." The daughter from Fresno had a complete breakdown during Victoria's manipulation, spending 2 years in therapy struggling with self-doubt because everyone convinced her that her perceptions were wrong. One daughter from another family moved across the country to escape the drama. Another hasn't spoken to her father since his divorce from Victoria. The damage to those family relationships was permanent. "What made the difference for us?" I asked. Dad turned from the window. "You did, Emma. You handled it with such wisdom that it forced me to question what I was being told about you. I just took Victoria's advice literally. You demonstrated through your actions that the person Victoria described didn't match who you actually were, Sarah said. That created cognitive dissonance that eventually broke through the manipulation. We called Jennifer and asked if she'd speak with Robert Chen about Victoria's history. Jennifer agreed, but warned us that previous attempts had been unsuccessful. People want to believe they've found love after loss, she said. When someone tells them their new partner is manipulative, it often reinforces the partner's narrative about jealous family members. 3 months later, Jennifer called with an update. Robert Chen had discovered financial irregularities and confronted Victoria about unauthorized transactions. Victoria had left Portland suddenly, taking cash from the business accounts. 6 months after that, Victoria was arrested in Seattle for elder financial abuse. This time, the family pressed charges, and Victoria faced serious legal consequences. It's over, Sarah said when we heard. At least for now. Do you feel vindicated? Dad asked me. I feel sad, I said honestly, sad for all the families she damaged, all the relationships destroyed. And sad for her, because she chose manipulation over authentic connection, and now she's facing the consequences alone. That autumn, Dad and Sarah invited me to dinner at Sunset Cafe. At my place setting was a small wrapped gift. What's this for? I asked. Inside was a necklace with a pendant engraved truth surfaces. Emma, Dad said, you never got proper credit for the wisdom you showed during that time. When Victoria told you to build your own life, she was trying to isolate you, Sarah added. But you took her advice and used it to become genuinely independent. That authenticity made her manipulation impossible to sustain. The necklace is a reminder that truth really does surface when you stop fighting it, Dad said. You trusted that reality would eventually become clear, and you were right. We toasted to lessons learned, strength discovered, and family relationships that survive attempts at destruction because they're built on genuine love, rather than obligation. Years passed. I spoke at conferences about recognizing manipulation in family situations. The most important lesson I shared was that when someone tells you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time. When someone gives you advice about changing to accommodate their needs, consider whether that advice serves your growth or their control. How do you know if you're responding correctly to manipulation? One woman asked. You know you're responding correctly when your authentic actions force the manipulator to reveal their true intentions, I answered. Manipulation only works when you play the assigned role. When you refuse and become genuinely who you're meant to be, the manipulation becomes visible. 10 years after Victoria first entered our lives, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through Jennifer Walsh. Victoria was writing from a rehabilitation facility where she was receiving treatment for financial crimes. The letter was brief and formal but contained something I'd never expected: an acknowledgement. Emma, it read. I am writing to inform you that I have been receiving counseling regarding my past behavior. My therapist suggested making amends might benefit my recovery. I recognize my actions toward your family were manipulative and harmful. I was motivated by financial insecurity rather than genuine care. I hope you have been able to build the independent life I suggested you needed. Victoria Hartwell. I showed the letter to Dad and Sarah over dinner. How do you feel about it? Dad asked. Disappointed, I said. I hoped for some sign she'd learned about authentic relationships. This sounds like she learned manipulation has legal consequences. Not that it hurts people, she's still thinking strategically rather than authentically, Sarah observed. Are you going to respond? What would be the point? She's not apologizing because she understands the harm. She's apologizing because her therapist told her to. I filed the letter away, not out of resentment but as a record of a chapter that had ended years ago. Some stories don't need epilogues when the main characters have moved on to write better ones. 15 years later, at Dad's 75th birthday party, surrounded by chosen family including Sarah's children and their families, I realized Victoria had ultimately given us the greatest gift. She had taught us to distinguish between relationships built on manipulation and those built on mutual respect. Every connection in our lives was now authentic, chosen consciously, maintained through genuine care rather than obligation or fear. We had learned to recognize love that enhances versus love that diminishes, support that empowers versus support that controls. Emma, Dad said during his toast, "Thank you for teaching me that the strongest families survive attempts at destruction and emerge more connected. Thank you for teaching me that real love multiplies rather than divides," I responded. As the celebration continued, I reflected on the journey from that first Saturday when Victoria told me to build my own life, to this moment surrounded by the life I'd actually built. She had been right about needing independence, but her vision of isolation and suspicion had been counterfeit. Real independence meant maintaining loving relationships without losing yourself, recognizing manipulation without becoming manipulative in response, trusting your perceptions while remaining open to growth. Victoria had tried to teach me that love was weakness, family was burden, authenticity was naivety. Instead, she taught me that love is strength, chosen family is treasure, and authenticity is the most powerful response to manipulation. "Thanks for the lesson, Victoria," I whispered one final time, meaning it completely, not because she intended to give me anything valuable, but because I had learned to extract wisdom from difficult experiences. The evening continued with stories and laughter, each moment testament to relationships built on truth, rather than manipulation, enhanced by growth, rather than diminished by control. Victoria had accidentally taught us to recognize authentic love by showing us its opposite, and for that lesson, however unintentionally given, I would always be genuinely grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.